The glass shatters, footsteps rise through the dark. On the third floor, a terrified boy is frozen in trauma. And between him and a masked gunman stands a barefoot woman holding nothing but a paper knife. No armor, no backup, no chance of surviving. In that single moment, the contract wife ceases to exist. What remains is something far more dangerous, a woman willing to die for a family that was never supposed to be hers, and that is where this tragedy turns into legend.
Within the brutal calculus of Chicago's criminal elite, strength is not tallied by body counts or battalions. It is codified in lineage, in the heir who secures the dynasty. A sovereign without a successor is but a regent, his reign a fleeting chapter before the inevitable conflict. Conrad Valletti confronted this dynastic void 3 years prior, following a physician's decree that fractured his syndicate's foundation. A treacherous truce delivered a poison that targeted not just his existence, but the very concept of his legacy. The diagnosis was biological finality, absolute infertility. He governed a vast billion-dollar enterprise of both shadow and light, yet was reduced to a terminal point in his own bloodline. In his domain, sterile is a more fatal sentence than bullet, an existential weakness his rivals could sense. Murmurs began to circulate in insulated circles. Conrad Valletti's authority now had a known terminus, prompting every subordinate to plot for the impending vacuum. Yet, destiny often disregards biology, and in Chicago, fortune delights in irony. We are introduced to Reese Calloway, age 27, navigating a life of relentless work at Serafina, an establishment within Conrad's covert portfolio. She was, by all appearances, the antithesis of royalty. Submerged by $280,000 in medical debt from her deceased mother, she weathered the nightly condescension of patrons who treated her as animate decor. Her former partner, a financier named Grant Hartwell, had deemed her damaged goods upon discovering her financial burden and promptly departed. Reese Calloway's existence was a quiet disintegration, another spirit ground down by the city's indifference. Yet this calculus omitted a critical variable. The evening Conrad Valletti entered Serafina. He perceived no brokenness. He witnessed resilience under duress, a core of iron absorbing impact without fracture, a bearing that was her last inviolable asset. He sought not a fragile ornament destined to crack under strain, but a proven survivor, an individual who had confronted ruin and remained upright. Herein lies the undocumented saga of a crime lord rendered obsolete by biology, and the impoverished server who would alter his destiny. This is a narrative woven with threads of authority, duplicity, an unlikely bond, and a biological improbability that redefined the trajectory of Chicago's most formidable syndicate. If this prospectus intrigues you, endorse this analysis, share it within your circles, and follow for subsequent chapters. Let us return to Chicago's unforgiving avenues, to the moment Conrad Valletti first laid eyes upon the agent of his transformation. Conrad Valletti occupied the prime table in Serafina's most profound recess, a space where illumination was scarce and a brick facade provided a tactical shield from the main floor. His 2 sentinels were positioned at the entryway, within striking distance, but beyond auditory range. The menu went unread. The establishment was a syndicate holding, obscured by layered corporate structures. His gaze, the color of a gathering storm, was fixed upon the server, who, having just absorbed a tirade from a group of elites, placed their dishes with unshakable composure. Reese approached the secluded table, her posture unbending, a small notepad in hand. A subtle redness tinged her eyes, yet her tone was impeccably even. "Good evening. May I take your order?" Conrad disregarded the pleasantry. He inclined his head, fixing her with a stare that could unnerve Chicago's most seasoned figures. "You were serving table 7, he stated, his voice a quiet, measured instrument. This was an observation, not an inquiry. Table 7 was occupied by Vera Ashton's party. Reese's grip on her notepad intensified, her knuckles bleaching. She was aware of his identity. It was common knowledge among Serafina's staff. The protocol from her first day was clear. Serve Conrad Valletti with speed and silence, and avoid eye contact beyond 3 seconds. Reese held his gaze indefinitely. Yes, sir, I was, and if the question is whether I wept, I did not. There is no time for it. My shift concludes at 11 and 14 tables remain, so what is your order? Or would you prefer I find another server? A profound stillness enveloped them. In that moment, Conrad Valletti saw not a waitress feigning fortitude. He recognized the quality he had sought unconsciously for 3 years, an individual devoid of fear toward him. This was not a product of ignorance, but a resilience forged by adversities far greater than a menacing figure in a dimly lit restaurant. A double espresso, Conrad requested, the slightest upturn at his lips. Not a smile, but a tacit admission that this woman had met his challenge without flinching. Reese acknowledged, pivoted, and departed. She remained unaware that his intense gaze tracked her to the bar, through her preparation, and to a secluded kitchen alcove, where her hands for a moment shook as they gripped her apron. The tremor in her hands lasted precisely 3 seconds, after which she drew a steadying breath and resumed her duties. This was the full measure of vulnerability she allowed herself. Conrad observed both the lapse and the recovery. He departed Serafina at 10:45 that evening, forgoing a conventional tip for 3 folded $100 bills left beneath his cup. From his vehicle, he phoned his sole trusted operative outside the family. I need a complete dossier, he instructed, his tone imbued with the quiet authority of command. Reese Calloway, a server at Serafina, age 27. I require her financials, residence, academic history, her record, and all known connections. Have it on my desk by 7 a.m. tomorrow. By 3 in the morning, the requested file lay on his desk at his Lincoln Park residence. Sleep was forgone as he sat in his dimly lit study, scrutinizing every page with the intensity reserved for a high-stakes transaction. The subject, Reese Calloway, a native of Rockford, Illinois. Her father perished in an uncompensated industrial accident when she was 11. Her mother supported her through 13 years of dual employment until diagnosed with stage 3 pancreatic cancer. Reese, then a sophomore finance major at DePaul University, withdrew from her studies to become a caregiver. Her mother died 2 years prior, leaving a $280,000 liability for which Reese was a co-obligor. The dossier showed no criminal history, no influential relationships, and no existing loyalties. The conclusion was stark. She was entirely isolated. Conrad closed the folder. He remained in the dark, a single finger drumming a deliberate rhythm on his desk. The variables were aligning with the chilling accuracy of a master strategist's game. His internal summary was concise. The asset is untainted, durable, unaffiliated, and unintimidated. At 6 in the morning, with a cold fog drifting from Lake Michigan, Conrad Valletti was en route to Serafina. He possessed a proposition he would not repeat. At 6:15 a.m., Serafina was divested of its evening allure. The ambience of candlelight and fine aromas was replaced by the acrid scent of cleaning agents and stark utility lighting. There was only Reese Calloway methodically cleaning tables with a threadbare cloth. Her early arrival, 45 minutes ahead of schedule, secured an additional $50 weekly a sum that determined her daily meals. A click from the rear entrance broke the silence. The sound was anomalous. The culinary team was not due until 7. The manager was not expected until after 8. Access to that entrance was restricted to staff and the proprietor, a man who characteristically avoided primary doorways. Conrad Valetti materialized in the corridor unaccompanied. A dark coat fell to his knees over a loosely fastened shirt, exposing a hint of a scar on his shoulder. He appeared both unrested and intensely alert, his eyes possessing the same sharp, cold focus from the previous night. Reese remained motionless, damp rag in hand, exhibiting no impulse to retreat. "We are closed," she stated, her tone devoid of inflection. "Espresso is possible, but it requires a 20-minute warm-up. The kitchen is otherwise non-operational." Conrad declined the implicit offer of a seat, maintaining a distance of 3 paces. His hands were pocketed, his gaze communicating the gravity of his visit. "My purpose here is not coffee, Miss Calloway. I have a proposition for you, and I prefer directness." Reese placed her rag on the counter with deliberate precision, her focus locked on him. "Proceed." Conrad began his pitch with the steady cadence of a man accustomed to command. His delivery was ruthlessly efficient, every word vital. He outlined the existence of a powerful Midwest consortium, now under threat of a hostile takeover by an ambitious Russian, Anton Jerkov. Conrad's singular vulnerability, which Jerkov was leveraging, was the absence of a successor. A 12-month deadline had been set. Failure to produce an heir within this period would trigger a vote to divest him of authority, leading to the systematic dismantling of his enterprise. "I require a wife," Conrad stated bluntly. "This is a strategic partnership, not a romantic arrangement. I need an ally who can withstand my adversaries and navigate their machinations." It was to be a purely symbolic union. "You would reside in my house, maintaining the facade of my wife, for the council's sake. In exchange, I will nullify your $280,000 liability entirely. The collection agencies will cease, the compounding interest will halt, and the psychological weight will be lifted." For 10 seconds, Ree was utterly still, a caesura more telling than any negotiation tactic Conrad had encountered. Her subsequent words were measured, chosen with surgical precision. "You are the preeminent figure in Chicago's underworld. You could select any partner. Why have you chosen me?" For a waitress submerged in debt, his reasoning was direct. "Because last night I observed you endure a 20-minute psychological assault without exhibiting a single fissure in your composure. Any individual capable of withstanding such mental pressure without faltering possesses an internal fortitude that cannot be purchased. But there is a further disclosure I must make. Without this information, your consent would be fundamentally compromised." He paused, his jaw tightening to the point that a muscle twitched near his scar. This was a truth he had not voiced to an outsider in 3 years. "I am incapable of producing children. An assassination attempt 3 years prior left me permanently sterile. Medical experts have confirmed this. You would be binding yourself to a man who signifies the termination of his lineage. You must understand this before giving your answer." Ree regarded him for a considerable time. Her expression held no pity, nor did it betray fear. Instead, it was the quiet acknowledgement of one soul branded as defective by the world, recognizing another. "And if I consent," Ree stated deliberately, "I am integrated into your world." "You comprehend the nature of that world," Conrad affirmed with a single nod. "I cannot offer you safety, that would be a deception." What I can offer is respect, and I can assure you that within my sphere, no one will ever label you as damaged. This is a greater promise than any you have received before." Ree began to reply, but her focus was abruptly captured by a scene outside Serafina's front window. Through the pane, under the autumn Chicago light, Grant Hartwell passed by with his new spouse. She was youthful, blonde, and adorned in cashmere, a significant diamond on her hand with the slight curve of early pregnancy apparent. Grant displayed the serene smile of a man liberated from debilitating debt, the sort tied to a $280,000 cost for a loved one's medical care. He moved past the cafe without a glance inside. His indifference was the definitive proof that Ree Calloway was now an artifact of his past. Ree shifted her focus back to Conrad. Her eyes were clear, her jaw was set, and her voice was the glacial calm of one who has glimpsed the desolate outcome of refusal and elected to enter a war zone rather than be erased. "When does this begin?" she inquired. Conrad observed her for a final moment, his assessment confirmed. His choice had been correct. 2:00 this afternoon, Chicago City Hall. A vehicle will collect you at 1. You will require your identification, nothing more. He moved toward the rear exit, pausing at the kitchen's entrance. "And Miss Calloway," he noted, not turning back, "that $300 last night was not a gratuity, it was your final compensation." And then he departed. Ree stood solitary in the vacant cafe, her knuckles stark white against an oak table, her respiration swift and deep. She did not cry. No smile formed on her lips. For a precise interval of 3 seconds, she was immobile, then her fingers uncurled. She methodically folded the cleaning cloth, placed it on the counter, untied her apron, hung it on its designated hook, and exited Serafina for the last time. The ceremony commenced at 2 in the afternoon at City Hall, on the 5th floor in room 12, a constricted office smelling of aged documents and wax. There were no bouquets, no attendees, merely 2 other individuals. Judge Raymond Kessler was present, a sheen of perspiration on his forehead, betraying his anxiety around the man to whom he was deeply indebted. The other was Felix Valetti, Conrad's 28-year-old brother, who rested against a wall, arms folded, his expression as cold and impenetrable as a sheet of ice. As arranged, a black sedan dispatched by Conrad collected Ree from her dilapidated South Side apartment at 1:00. She was dressed in the only non-uniform garment she owned, a worn gray dress she had acquired from a thrift store for $12 3 years before. Her footwear consisted of the same scuffed black flats she had worn for the past 2 years. She had made no effort with her appearance. It was inconsequential. This was not a wedding, it was a business arrangement. Ree Calloway was accustomed to signing documents for high-interest loans, for leases she anticipated violating, for liabilities she could not satisfy. This was merely another signature on a line. The entire affair lasted less than 7 minutes. The judge's voice quavered as he recited the vows, his gaze flicking to Conrad as if seeking leave to draw breath. When it was his turn, Conrad uttered, "I do," with the flat, detached tone of someone finalizing a commercial deal. Ree echoed the words, her own voice equally devoid of sentiment, yet steady and distinct. She inscribed her name in the register with a stable hand, set the pen aside, and did not look at what she had written. Felix remained silent throughout, but his intense stare never left Ree. His eyes were the same shade of gray as his brother's, but keener, filled with a potent mixture of scorn and suspicion. He observed her like a grandmaster studying an unexpected gambit. A car transported them directly to the Valetti estate in Lincoln Park. Ree carried no baggage. Her possessions were not worth transporting. Her previous existence was contained in a single canvas suitcase, retrieved by Conrad's associates 2 hours prior, in a manner reminiscent of an evidence scene being sanitized. The residence was a 3-story limestone structure from the 1920s, situated on a quiet lakeside street. Externally, it resembled a museum, stately and inert. This impression persisted within. A soaring ceiling and a crystal fixture commanded the entrance hall, yet the atmosphere was still and frigid, like a forsaken cathedral. The marble surfaces gleamed like a dark mirror, unblemished by a single scuff mark, misplaced shoe, or casually discarded coat. It was a monument to affluence, a location for existing rather than for living. The first individual she encountered was Margaret Byrne, the 55-year-old housekeeper whose expression was stern but whose eyes held a genuine kindness. She took Ree's hand in both of her own, murmuring, "Welcome home," with a startling sincerity that Ree recognized as authentic. Paige Valeti was the first of the 4 younger family members to appear. At 24, she was dark-haired like the others and paired pearls with a simple dress, a strange juxtaposition of propriety and profound exhaustion. Ree recognized it in Paige immediately, a look she understood with a chilling familiarity, having witnessed it on her own reflection daily for the 2 years she had tended to her dying mother. It was the expression of a person shouldering a burden far too great for their age, a silent appeal for deliverance. "Hello," Paige uttered, the word civil but imbued with a slight persistent tremor that spoke of 1,000 unvoiced truths. Tommy was absent. "Tommy's in the art room," Conrad explained, indicating the 3rd floor. "He maintains a significant emotional distance." Ree cataloged this information. Then the 16-year-old twins, Nina and Noah, children of a brother lost 5 years ago, materialized from a recreation room, their movements like predators evaluating new game that had strayed into their territory. Nina's gaze swept over Ree, her voice projected for the whole hall to hear. "What interesting footwear. Did you purchase those at the $1 Emporium?" A derisive snort came from Noah beside her. Ree's eyes dropped to her own worn shoes, then lifted to meet Nina's. Her tone was flat, devoid of injury or malice. "I did, and they have proven more functional than any $1,000 pair you might possess." Nina was briefly silenced, her contemptuous expression faltering. It was in that moment Ree noticed, for the first time, the barest inclination of Conrad's head, a phantom smile he kept concealed. That evening, after Conrad had retreated to his 1st-floor office and a profound silence enveloped the mansion, Ree was approaching her 2nd-floor room when a figure emerged from the stairwell, obstructing her way. It was Felix Valeti, propped against the wall with his hands deep in his pockets. The hall lighting bisected his features, sculpting him from the surrounding gloom. He remained quiet, his stare a cold, unyielding pressure, allowing the silence to become a palpable force. In this house, Ree understood. Silence was a tool. "Listen closely," Felix finally spoke, his voice a quiet, calculated menace. "I am indifferent to whatever my brother perceives in you. It is of no consequence. I have seen dozens enter this house." He paused. "All of them have departed. You are a legal agreement, an ink mark on a document. Never imagine that this makes you one of us." Ree did not retreat. Despite his greater height and the contained energy of a man accustomed to resolving issues through force, she met his stare, and when she at last replied, her voice was perfectly composed, not defiant, but simply stark. It was the unnerving tranquility of someone who has been labeled as defective so often that the term has lost its power to wound. I am under no illusions, Felix. I comprehend my function here. I signed a contract and I fulfill my obligations. You may despise me, you may scrutinize me, you may subject me to any trial you devise, but I will be present tomorrow, and on the day that follows. She moved around him, her shoulder almost making contact, and proceeded directly to her room. She engaged the lock, rested her back against the cool wood, and only then did a tremor start in her hands. But there were no tears. Her capacity for tears had been exhausted long before her arrival in this place. The morning after her confrontation with Felix, Rhea awoke at 5 a.m. in a bedroom that dwarfed her old apartment. She stared at the high ceiling for 30 seconds, then rose to enact the only response she knew. When faced with chaos, she manufactured order. This wasn't about cleaning. The Validi estate employed Margaret Byrne and 2 others for that. Rhea's objective was more foundational. She set about rebuilding the very rhythm of the broken home. On the second day, she entered the kitchen at 6 a.m. to find an industrial refrigerator filled with catered meal boxes. Each bore a label: Conrad, Felix, Paige, Tommy, Nina, Noah. Every member of the house had a separate menu. They all took their meals alone, in different rooms, at different times. 6 people living under one roof but never sharing a table. Reopened the bin and one by one deliberately discarded every meal. From the doorway, Margaret Byrne observed in silence. And for the first time in a very long while, a faint smile touched the corner of her mouth. In that first week, while she cleared old glass jars from a pantry, a crate toppled and shattered on the stone tiling. A sharp shard of glass carved a deep wound into the arch of her left foot. But Rhea, well practiced in suppressing pain, simply cleaned the cut, bound it with a makeshift bandage, and mentioned it to no one. That night she prepared dinner. It was not an elaborate Italian dish or something from a fine restaurant. She cooked what her mother had made on Sundays in Rockford: roasted chicken, mashed potatoes, and a simple gravy. It was the kind of food whose aroma fills a house, an unspoken summons to gather. She laid out the long table in the main dining hall. It marked the first time, in the 4 years since the Validi matriarch's murder, that the table had been set for more than a single person. She did not call anyone to the meal. She simply cooked, arranged the settings, and took her seat. Paige was the first to materialize. She lingered in the doorway for nearly 2 minutes, her eyes fixed on the table, and Rhea sitting there alone before she entered and sat down without a word. Not and Noah came for the food, not the family, but they came. They sat, they ate, and for the first time in years, the room held the subtle sound of several forks and knives against plates. Tommy did not appear. Conrad did not appear. Felix strode past the dining room entrance, his gaze sweeping over the scene before he moved on without comment. But Rhea saw his pace hesitate for exactly 2 beats before he vanished. On the 3rd day, the 4th, and the 5th, Rhea cooked in the same manner, set the same table, and occupied the same chair. She never compelled anyone. She merely created a pocket of warmth and ritual, waiting to see who might enter it. Paige was the first to step inside, and she ventured the furthest. By the 4th day, she was no longer arriving just to eat. She started coming to the kitchen early, standing beside Rhea with her hands clasped, asking in a voice so low it seemed to anticipate rejection, "Can you show me how to make this sauce?" Rhea handed her the wooden spoon with minimal words, just, "Watch. Stir slow, keep it steady." And in the kitchen's warm quiet, fragrant with butter, garlic, and basil, Paige started to speak. Not of significant events, but of small, broken pieces. Fragments from the life she had known before the preceding 4 years. My mother used to love cooking. I miss how the kitchen smelled then. It's been dead since she died. Ree did not embrace her or offer hollow platitudes. She simply stood next to her, working and listened. She understood that some people do not require words. They just require a quiet, constant presence to bear witness to their sorrow. Tommy was the house's greatest enigma. At 19, he drifted like a phantom, spoke seldom, and seemed to never depart the third-floor art studio. Ree did not knock on his door. She did not ask him to join them. She just left a plate of hot food on a tray from Margaret Byrne outside his room each evening with a folded napkin alongside it. On the 5th morning, the tray was bare. On the 7th day, she discovered something waiting for her at the dining table. A small, hand-sized pencil sketch of a wildflower pushing through a crack in a sidewalk. There was no name and no note, but Ree knew the artist. She lifted the small drawing, examined it for a long moment, then carefully folded it and placed it in her pocket, where it remained all day. On the 9th day, a second drawing appeared. A sparrow on a windowsill. On the 12th, a sunset over Lake Michigan. Tommy had still not uttered a single word to her, yet he was communicating in his own dialect, and Ree received every message perfectly. Na and Noah presented a much simpler problem. Ree never debated, scolded, or lectured. She met each of their provocations with the serene humor that their adolescent cruelty could not breach. When Noah purloined her only pair of shoes, and she heard his muffled laughter from a hiding spot, Ree just walked into the kitchen barefoot and began to cook. The absence of a reaction so unnerved him that he returned the shoes before dinner. A prank without an audience yields no satisfaction. When Na scoffed, "Why are your clothes so cheap? You're married to the family head," Ree answered, "Fine clothes can't roast a chicken," and served the crispiest piece onto Na's plate. The girl consumed every bite, her defiance momentarily quelled by a more primal need. Felix was an entirely different creature. Felix was not a child. He was a 28-year-old man who had taken lives, who had watched his brother nearly perish 3 years prior, and who had vowed no outsider would ever get close enough to inflict harm again. He did not hide Ree's shoes. He was engaged in a far more lethal contest. A deep background inquiry on her was already underway, conducted through his private, untraceable network. He interrogated Margaret Byrne daily for any indication of Ree snooping in Conrad's office, any clandestine calls or meetings with unknown individuals. His arrival at dinner on the 6th evening was not a truce. It was a tactical move to observe her at close range. Throughout the meal, he studied her with a wolf's unblinking focus, searching for any fissure in her composure. Ree felt his stare. She knew Felix was waiting for one mistake, a single misplaced query, a glimmer of greed. Fear was not a factor. Her only secret was the growing collection of Tommy's art hidden in her pocket. During the 3rd week, Conrad departed for Boston to negotiate terms with an East Coast syndicate, a display of power he could not entrust to another. To be absent from his seat would be interpreted as a retreat, a signal to his adversaries that Conrad Valetti was vulnerable. 3 days, he informed Felix before the car left for O'Hare. 3 days! Secure the perimeter, isolate the family, no one in or out until my return. Felix acknowledged his understanding. Conrad's gaze then settled on Ree in the kitchen doorway, lingering for 2 heartbeats longer than was typical. He entered the car without a word of farewell. In his world, goodbyes were a vulnerability for men who lived with the constant possibility of not coming back. The first day elapsed in a misleading calm. Ree cooked. Paige assisted in the kitchen. Na and Noah bickered over the television before dining together. At the table, Tommy left another sketch for Ree, a cat asleep in a patch of sun. Every 2 hours, Felix performed his security patrols, inspecting cameras, gates, and locks, his eyes executing a cold, systematic scan of Ree each time he passed. On the second night, that delicate tranquility shattered. At 23:43, Ree sat at the kitchen table, a lone figure under the house's only illumination, studying an old business ledger, a ritual to steady her thoughts. The children were all asleep. Felix was on the ground floor in the chamber next to Conrad's study, sleeping with a handgun beneath his pillow, the only way he could find rest. The first thing Ree registered was the sound, or its absence. The silence felt wrong. Not a lack of noise, but a muted quality, as if the air itself had been dampened. Her gaze jumped from the ledger to the security display. The camera at the front gate was on a loop. It was not a malfunction. A lost signal would show a blue screen. This was a phantom image, replaying endlessly, the same tree branch swaying, the same guard frozen in position. Someone had infiltrated the system and was feeding some a recording. Ree suppressed the instinct to scream. She did not run. Her heart beat a frantic tempo against her ribs, but her hands moved with pure instinct, a step ahead of her mind. She extinguished the kitchen light, grabbed her phone, and dialed Felix. He replied in under a second. Her voice was a low, steady whisper. "The gate feed is a loop. We're compromised. Get upstairs now." Felix posed no questions. He understood that in this life, when the system breaks, the next 30 seconds determine who lives and who dies. The sound of his boots on the oak stairs was like thunder as Ree moved from the kitchen into the central hall. A shock wave of exploding glass tore through the residence. The sitting room door, the one that opened to the garden, had been blown inward. The detonation was precise and professional, not a rock through a pane, but a clean breach made by an expert's tool. Ree and Felix converged at the base of the stairs. In the hall's dim light, she saw the firearm in his hand and saw his eyes, no longer assessing her, but scanning for a threat. "How many?" Felix demanded, his voice even, but his jaw clenched. "No idea. All cameras are blind. No signal from the gate. Could be 3, could be a dozen." An unnatural incandescence erupted from the garden. The percussive shatter of glass under combat boots confirmed the breach of their sanctuary. They were within the walls. Reese pivoted, her gaze targeting the summit of the staircase. "Paige," she projected, her tone engineered to ascend, but not to spread. "The safe room. Bring the twins. Immediately. Leave everything. Move." The response from above was a frantic scramble, the creak of a door, Na's sleepy inquiry. "What's going on?" Met by Paige's sharp imperative. Silence. "Follow me." The sanctum, a steel-reinforced haven constructed by Conrad, awaited them down the corridor. Secured from within, it offered 12 hours of air for 6 souls. Reese registered the definitive sound of the steel bolt locking into place. 3 children were now secure. 2 remained exposed to the threat. Tommy. The name itself was a visceral impact. He resided on the 3rd floor, cocooned within his art studio. The 19-year-old insulated himself with sound, a nightly defense against the echoes of his mother's death. The invasion went unnoticed. He was isolated. Reese's gaze found Felix's, And in that instant of shared crisis, their history of animosity dissolved. They were reduced to a primal calculus, a head count that yielded a deficit of 1. "Tommy is on 3, she stated. Felix moved toward the stairs. "I will get him." "No." Reese's hand shot out, her voice a blade that halted his advance. "Your purpose is to defend the staircase. Should they reach the 2nd floor, that door becomes the final barrier. You possess the sole firearm. Secure this position. Allow no one to pass. I will retrieve Tommy." Felix regarded her, and for the first time since branding her a contractual obligation, his expression shed its contempt, revealing something deeper. It resembled fear. "Are you mad?" Felix's voice was a low growl. "They are armed." "And what are you? You have nothing to risk." "I have Tommy," she retorted. Her voice shed its former identities. It was now an ancient, instinctual force, a declaration of maternal ferocity that outmatched any steel. "Hold the stairs, Felix." She pivoted toward the 3rd floor abyss, defenseless, her bare feet making no sound on the cold wood, her heart a violent drum. From below she heard Felix's curse, followed by the crisp, mechanical sound of a bullet being chambered, his weapon now trained on the ascending shadows and sounds. The 3rd level was an absolute void. The power had been severed externally during the camera hack, creating a corridor of blackness punctuated by a single sliver of moonlight. Reese advanced, each step a fresh agony radiating from an old wound in her foot. While her bare feet offered the gift of silence, the reality was a fever-induced swelling had rendered shoes unbearable for days. Tommy's studio sat at the hall's terminus, its door ajar, a portal to sheer blackness. Reese entered, allowing her vision to calibrate to the gloom. And then she found him. He was compressed into a corner, caught between an easel and a fortress of canvases. He clutched his sketchbook to his chest like a bulwark, knees drawn in tight, his gaze fixed upon a horror 1,000 miles beyond the room. Reese recognized that hollow gaze. It mirrored her mother's in her final weeks, a mind exiled by agony. Tommy was no longer present. He was adrift in a 4-year-old memory. The night he witnessed his mother's murder, shot 3 times in the room below. He was merely 15. Tonight's violence had plunged him back into that paralysis. "Tommy!" Reese knelt, contracting her form, her voice a gentle murmur against the tempest in her chest. "Tommy, it is Reese. I need you to stand for me now. Can you hear me?" Her question dissolved into the void. His eyes saw through her, a transparent obstacle. His grip on the sketchbook was so fierce his knuckles were bleached white. His body was racked with a tremor, a ghost of memory that no opiate could exorcise. Then, footsteps on the landing, measured, heavy, methodical, not Felix. Felix was defending the 2nd floor. Ree had registered 2 gunshots, the acoustics of a struggle. This signified one intruder was downstairs, and another had found an alternate ascent. The East Service stairs, she surmised, a route she had discovered in her first week. The steps ceased just outside the studio. Ree rose, turning from the boy to face the door. Her hand searched a nearby table, past canvases, and found a stainless steel palette knife, barely 6 inches long, an artist's tool. It was a thing of no consequence in her palm. An implement for letters, not a weapon, but it represented the sum of her options. For 27 years, Reese Calloway had survived on what was at hand, and her spirit remained intact. The door exploded inward. A large figure in black stood framed, face obscured, a silenced weapon held ready. His gaze scanned, located Tommy, the objective, then fixed on Ree, the human barricade. He inclined his head. A flicker of dissonance at this unexpected defiance. A woman in sleepwear with a paltry knife. Ree did not retreat. She held her position, barefoot, the frigid floor, the useless tool in her hand. She met the assassin's stare with eyes that Grant Hartwell had dismissed as broken, Vera Ashton had perceived as decor, and Chicago had overlooked entirely. When she spoke, her voice was even. To reach him, you must first pass through me. The man raised his pistol, and in that precise instant, a different shot shattered the silence, one originating from the hallway behind him. Felix Validi stood at the corridor's end, his respiration labored. A crimson stain blossomed on his left shoulder from a fresh wound. Smoke drifted from his firearm. His bullet had found its mark an instant before the assassin fired. The assailant fell, his weapon skittering away. Felix advanced, kicked the gun aside, and neutralized the threat, speaking into his phone. "Third floor, secure, requesting immediate support." Ree ignored the neutralized threat, her focus returning to Tommy. He was still in the corner, but his gaze had shifted. He no longer looked past her. He was seeing her, and on his tear-streaked 19-year-old face was the one expression Ree had sought her whole life. It was absolute trust. Kneeling beside him, she discarded the palette knife and drew him into an embrace. Tommy's sketchbook fell away as his hands seized her arms with the desperation of a drowning man. Silent, shuddering sobs began. A 15-year-old's grief emerging from a 19-year-old's form, a catharsis 4 years delayed. Within these walls, he had never been taught that tears were not synonymous with weakness. Reinforcements materialized in 7 minutes. 12 minutes later, Conrad's federal assets assumed control, and the attacker vanished from existence. No official record was made. This was the nature of their reality. In the corridor, Ree and Felix rested against the wall, a mere breath apart. Tommy slept in her lap, his breathing steady, his sketchbook beside the palette knife. Felix's gaze was fixed on the middle distance, the blood on his shoulder a dark sigil. At last he looked at her. For 2 weeks he had assessed her, dissected her history, and judged her a liability. For the first time, all condescension was gone. There was only the raw respect of a violent man who had just witnessed a barefoot woman with an artist's tool prepare to die for his brother. "You could have fled," Felix rasped. "You had no obligation. This is not your blood." Reese gazed at the boy in her lap, her hand a soothing presence in his hair. Her response was imbued with a newfound certainty. "You are mistaken, Felix. This became my family the instant I entered this house." Felix remained silent. Then, in a significant gesture, he removed his black leather jacket, a piece of his very armor, one she had never seen him without, and draped it over her shoulders. In the Mafia, such a gesture is a declaration, not a courtesy. It is a claim. It announces, she is under my aegis. To harm her is to harm me. Ree drew the jacket tighter, its leather retaining his warmth. For the first time within this house, she felt she belonged. Conrad received Felix's call at 12:17 in the morning in a Boston hotel. His universe froze for 3 seconds. That brief pause stretched into an eternity, eclipsing years of sterile diagnoses and nights spent poisoned on a hospital floor, because for those 3 seconds he was suspended in the not knowing of who in his home was still breathing. Felix delivered his report with the brutal efficiency of his profession. An assault. 4 hostiles. Security compromised. Gate guards down. Tommy, the target. The threat contained. No casualties. Support on site. Conrad required no further details. He terminated the call, was clothed in 40 seconds, and had the black Maserati roaring out of Boston at 123 miles per hour within 2 minutes. He pointed the car west on Interstate 90, a direct course for Chicago. A 6-hour journey. He did not pause for fuel or sustenance. He just drove, knuckles blanched on the wheel, his focus absolute. A single refrain echoed in his mind. The loss of one more soul from that house would utterly shatter him. 4 years prior, he had buried his mother. 3 years prior, he had nearly buried himself. He had weathered both storms. Yet on that desolate highway connecting Boston and Chicago, Conrad conceded that his sphere of protection had expanded beyond Felix or Tommy, Paige, or the twins. It now encompassed Ree. The waitress hired less than 3 weeks ago had been added to a list of people for whom he would ignite a city. The moment of that shift remained unknown. At 6:15 that morning, the Maserati arrived at the Lincoln Park Estates gates. Conrad emerged into the piercing cold of a Chicago dawn, noting the shattered sitting room door was already sheathed in plywood, a clean repair executed overnight. There were no police cars, no forensic tape, no indication that 10 hours earlier the grounds had been a war zone. In the world of Conrad Velitti, the evidence of battle vanished before sunrise. He entered the front door, not into the sterile silence Felix had described, but into the warm tranquility of a sleeping residence. The primary sitting room, where glass had shattered and projectiles had flown, was now illuminated by a low, rekindled fire. On the long charcoal sofa, Ree slept, her posture upright in the corner, her head canted to one side. Tommy was curled upon the sofa with his head resting in her lap, his expression more peaceful than Conrad had ever witnessed. Paige was asleep at the far end on a cluster of blankets, a hand gripping Tommy's shirt as if to anchor him there. Tommy's sketchbook lay on the floor beside a small paper knife. Conrad focused on the knife, its purpose an enigma, until he detected movement. Felix occupied a chair near the foyer, a pistol on his lap, the dark circles under his eyes attesting to a night-long watch. He rose as Conrad approached, and the two brothers exchanged a silent, weighted look. Felix then delivered his report, his voice low and devoid of emotion, a clinical summary of the incursion. He detailed the cameras failing, the jarring sound of fracturing glass, and Ree's reaction a fraction of a second before his own. He conveyed her directive to move Paige to the safe room, her command for him to defend the stairs, and her solitary barefoot ascent to the 3rd floor in total darkness. Felix paused, and when he resumed, his tone had fundamentally shifted. It was no longer a report. It was the testimony of a man trying to process an impossibility. "She confronted him with a letter opener," Felix stated, his gaze not on Conrad, but upon Ree's slumbering form. The intruder held a suppressed pistol. Her instrument was a paper knife, shorter than one's finger. She must have known death was certain. Do you see? She knew, and she did not waver. Felix turned back to his brother, and his eyes, which for 2 weeks had held only disdain for Ree, now contained a reverence Conrad had only ever seen him bestow upon his own blood. "She had the option to flee, brother. No one would have expected otherwise. She was merely a name on a contract." Felix swallowed hard. "But she held her ground." Conrad offered no reply. He moved past Felix, entered the sitting room, and paused beside the sofa. He simply stood, observing Ree, his eyes fixed on her hand, which even in sleep remained on Tommy's hair. His gaze drifted to her bare feet, a stark emblem of the previous night's vulnerability. He registered the incongruous weight of Felix's leather jacket draped over her frame, and deep within his chest, a barricade he had erected after his mother's death, and fortified on the day he was told he would never father a son, began to splinter. Conrad dropped to one knee beside the couch. The sight of this apex figure kneeling was enough to rouse Rhee. Her eyes opened, immediately locking onto him. Then her body tensed, an instinctual, combative response. Her gaze swept the room for dangers before finally returning to his. Conrad was intimately familiar with that behavior, the subconscious environmental scan for threats that he and Felix lived by. That Rhee now executed it so fluidly signaled a deep internal alteration. It was not a conscious choice, but a brutal conditioning, a truth that struck him with a mixture of grim pride and a profound, aching sorrow. "You are uninjured." Conrad's voice was a monotone. His jaw, however, was a clenched knot of steel, and his eyes were anything but serene. They were cold, predatory, searching her for any sign of blood or bruising, any evidence of violation. "I am fine," Rhee managed, her voice hoarse with fatigue. Conrad gave a slow, methodical nod. His jaw tightened further, his voice dropping to a register Felix called the threshold of no return, a tone where Conrad's voice did not rise. It lowered until the air itself felt thin, and people held their breath to listen. "You faced an armed man with a letter opener. You were unarmored. You were unarmed. You ran barefoot toward certain death." The fury was a tempest, but its target was himself, for his failure to be present, for the fact that she had assumed a role that was his alone, for a debt he now owed that could never be settled. Rhee held his gaze without apology, without clarification, without defense. She delivered a single sentence, her voice so devoid of emotion, so absolute, it cut through his rage with surgical precision. The arrangement was a fallacy by the second week, Conrad. He could only stare. She maintained his gaze, and in that charged space, the psychic fortress Conrad had spent 3 years constructing, built of poison, infertility, and the fear of more loss, was irreparably demolished. Through the ruins, he no longer perceived a waitress or a contract bride. He saw the woman who would die for his family armed with a paper knife, and a certainty that defied all reason took hold. He would never permit her to leave that house. Conrad turned to his brother and gave a single, terse command. "Out!" He closed the door, moved a chair to her bedside, and remained there for 2 days. For 48 hours, the most formidable man in Chicago's criminal hierarchy watched over a waitress as a fever consumed her. He replaced the cool cloth on her forehead every 20 minutes, raised her to drink water, and monitored every single breath she drew. He counted them just as he had his mother's 4 years ago, a vigil that had concluded in failure. On the second night, at approximately 3 a.m, the fever broke. Rhee's eyes fluttered open. The first thing she registered was Conrad. He was gripping the mattress, as if she might drift away should he release his hold. Dark bruises of exhaustion shadowed his eyes. A 2-day growth of stubble covered his jaw. His shirt was a canvas of wrinkles. The billionaire kingpin resembled any other man, terrified of losing the one asset that wealth could not secure. "Conrad," Rhee whispered, her voice a faint sound. He lifted his head, and the relief that flooded his expression was so fierce it was almost violent. It was the reprieve of a man spared at the last second. He leaned in closer, his knuckles white against the mattress. When he finally spoke, all command had vanished from his tone. It was the voice of a man who, in the dark of a 2-night watch, had finally conceded he could not survive losing her. "You concealed that injury for 3 weeks. You almost succumbed to a piece of glass you never revealed. Do you have any comprehension of how that affects me? Ree observed him, her eyes clouded but aware. Angry. No, Conrad said, and the word fractured. It was a small, clean break, but Ree perceived it. She was observing the impossible. Conrad Valetti's composure failing him. Not angry, terrified. I initiated a contract for a business partner. I received someone whose loss would compel me to burn this city to ash. I love you, Ree, and that terrifies me more than any bullet ever has. The room was perfectly silent. Only the quiet drip of the ivy and the sound of the wind disturbed the stillness. Ree studied him for a long beat. Then, with a fragile and unsteady hand, she reached up and traced the scar that ran along his jaw. Her fingers moved with a slow solemnity, as if deciphering the history carved into his skin. Conrad stayed completely motionless. To the rest of the world, Ree whispered, her voice lucid despite its softness. I am damaged, a liability, a cast-off. But here, with you, I want to remain. Not for the wealth, not for $280,000. For you. Conrad's hand closed over hers, his own engulfing it as he leaned forward, pressing his forehead against hers. He was near enough for Reed to see the silver specks in his beard. In that room, at 3 a.m, the transactional agreement between the sterile crime lord and the desperate waitress dissolved. In its place, something grew that no contract could ever bind. After the assault, Conrad Valetti's pattern of existence within his own home began to alter. It wasn't a single event, but a gradual succession of minor shifts. He started to return home before 7 o'clock. Previously, he was an apparition until 10 at night, disappearing into his locked office. Now his presence was felt earlier. Instead of isolating himself, he began to occupy a seat at the dinner table. He spoke infrequently. He simply sat, partaking in the food Ree had cooked, absorbing Paige's stories, and observing Nina and Noah. Occasionally, his gaze would fix on Ree with an intensity that Felix perceived but did not question. It was the look of a man trying to solve the complex equation of how one person could fundamentally change the physics of a room. The most notable evolution, however, involved Tommy. One evening, 2 weeks later, Conrad was moving past the third-floor art studio, a corridor he had always traversed, but this time he paused. Tommy was immersed in his private world, his headphones a barrier against reality. His brother, Conrad, pierced that delicate silence, delivering the first real words between them since their mother's services. Following a long silence that hinted at a deep internal struggle, Tommy showed him the canvas. It depicted a woman poised between shadow and light, a clear allegorical representation of a mother. Its message was unmistakable. After examining it, Conrad offered a single subdued word of acclaim. In response, Tommy, who had been selectively silent for 4 years, spoke a full, defensive sentence. Ree did not abandon me. The boy's world was anchored by a singular act of allegiance, a stand-in for the maternal shield lost with their mother's death. Conrad's response came not through language, but through a weighted hand on his brother's shoulder, leading to a quiet 20-minute communion over his art. This silent exchange represented their deepest dialogue in 4 years. In the 5 months since her courthouse vows, Reese's public persona had been entirely reforged. The woman who now entered the Palmer house was a stranger. The waitress she once was erased. Her severe black dress was less a garment than a statement, its stark elegance a uniform of purpose. Her sole adornment was a platinum band, a symbol Conrad had offered from desire, not duty, 2 months prior. The black heels, a gift from Paige, were instruments of confidence she had mastered in a week of private practice. Pulled back hair exposed a newly chiseled jaw, while her gaze, once a mirror of past trauma, now reflected the chilling clarity of Lake Michigan in winter. To her right, Conrad's prominent facial scar was not a disfigurement, but a declaration of his very essence. At Reese's left, Felix's presence was a palpable, self-appointed oath of protection, a nuance not lost on the assembly. Behind them, Paige's composure at 24 years old betrayed a lifetime spent mediating conflicts among dangerous men. Here stood the Valeti family, a unified front before the council for the first time in the 4 years following their mother's slaying, a demonstration of strength far surpassing mere words. The conclave convened in a dark, oak-clad chamber of the Palmer House, a space where Prohibition-era Titans had once partitioned the city. Power's ceremonial exchange had persisted, merely adopting new attire. 14 men from 7 dominant clans, the arbiters of the region's clandestine economies, were present. This assembly operated beyond statute, an unwritten covenant founded on intimidation and violence. Upon entering, Ree's gaze sliced across the room to locate Vera Ashton, a specter from her former life, relegated to the wives section as her husband, Federal Judge Harrison Ashton, was merely a piece on their board. Vera's words died as her eyes met Ree's form in the doorway, and for a moment, time fractured. A tremor ran through her hand, causing a champagne flute to fall, it shattering the sole sound in the abrupt silence. Vera's expression was one of pure disbelief, a woman staring at an apparition from a life she thought was over. This was not the docile employee she had once derided as breathing furniture. Ree gave no sign of recognition, her focus already past the specter, settling at the table's head where a fleeting tension in her own jaw was consciously suppressed. In a secondary row, Grant Hartwell sat beside the coiled stillness of a man called Antonov. Grant's suit was immaculate, just as it was when he had labeled her damaged goods. But time had started its corrosive work on him. Dark rings hollowed his eyes, and his jawline was newly sharp with strain. In his stare, Ree detected an emotion absent 5 months ago. A poisonous blend of remorse and corrosive envy. It was the affliction of a man realizing the worth of what he had destroyed. She severed their connection in less than a second. She took the unoccupied chair next to Conrad at the table's south end, claiming a seat of power left empty for 4 years. The meeting commenced with the choreographed rituals Conrad had carefully prepared her for. Following rote recitations of territory and earnings, Antonov Jerkov stood. His presence seemed to leach the heat from the air, creating a tangible cold. His speech was slow, his Russian accent a calculated rhythm, like a predator confident of its trapped quarry. He then declared his intent to contest the Valeti family's council position. Jerkov's plan unfolded like a pincer attack. His first move was to frame Conrad Valeti's childlessness as a systemic vulnerability, depicting a lineage without succession as a danger to their collective stability. The second, more savage assault came from Grant Hartwell. On Jerkov's cue, Grant circulated a dossier to each member. With the clinical tone of an undertaker, he outlined its contents. Fabricated evidence of the Valetis' illegal financial activities, designed to provoke a federal probe that would utterly consume them. The proposal was not a solution, but a corporate assassination. A council seizure of all Valeti holdings, placing their domain under a temporary stewardship managed by Jerkov. All eyes turned to Conrad, yet Conrad disregarded the documents, his gaze fixed on Grant Hartwell with a singular, burning rage. Grant knew that look. It mirrored the primal fear he once felt trespassing in a secured Velity facility. Conrad's anger was a tangible presence, his hand balling into a fist beneath the table, a signal of violence so near that Felix's own hand went to his sidearm. As Conrad's body tensed for an act that would have ignited bloodshed, a hand settled on his arm, its touch soft, yet undeniable. Rhee's focus was entirely on him. With a slight incline of her head, her voice came as a private directive. "Let me." For 3 held breaths, the council observed, captivated. Then, the inconceivable happened. Conrad receded, the strain vanishing from his frame as his fist relaxed. The council had just seen a silent coup. Conrad Velity, a man who yielded to none, had just ceded command to his wife. With a measured, intentional poise, Rhee rose, knowing she was the focal point of all scrutiny. She navigated from her chair to the table's center, positioning herself before the dossier intended as their downfall. Her voice, lucid and steady, declared, "Gentlemen of the council, I am Rhee Velity. I wish to examine the documentation Mr. Jerkov has presented." Anton Jerkov leaned back, a patronizing smile on his face, the expression of a monarch evaluating a peasant who had strayed into his presence. "This is a boardroom, Mrs. Velity," Jerkov intoned, his accent twisting her name into a taunt. "Not a restaurant." A few low, obsequious laughs followed the insult. Grant Hartwell looked at the table, his muteness an admission of guilt. Both men functioned under a critical miscalculation. That her past defined her present. They were mistaken. Rhee allowed the remark to fade. She merely offered her hand, palm upward, a quiet, unyielding demand. With an indifferent shrug, Yerkov pushed the file her way, an act of scorn rooted in his belief in her ineptitude. She did not merely read the pages. She consumed them, her concentration sharpened by 2 years of finance at DePaul before trauma upended her world. For the past 5 months at the Velety compound, her nights were spent not in rest, but in study. Within the library's quiet, under a solitary lamp, she had methodically deconstructed every financial record available, from property deeds to tax havens and wire logs. This was not an assigned duty, but an act of self-preservation, a drive to chart the landscape of her new reality. In Conrad's universe, finance was the native language, and she had become a master of it. Following 3 minutes of absolute stillness, Rhee concluded her review. She placed the file down, a finger resting on page 17. Her eyes met Jerkov's. "Mr. Jerkov," Rhee stated, her tone devoid of emotion, "the 12 property conveyances detailed here are Section 1031 exchanges. This is a standard tax deferment tactic, lawfully employed by countless American investors annually. This is not a criminal plot, it is fundamental accounting." A current of discomfort moved through the chamber. Jerkov's face grew rigid. Rhee proceeded, her focus shifting to page 23. "The actual felony, however, is located here. A lawful exchange demands supporting documentation. Our family's original records contain all such exhibits." She tapped the dossier. "In the version Mr. Hartwell supplied, each one has been methodically excised. Not some. All 12. This is no simple error. It is a premeditated act of fabrication." A profound quiet descended. Grant Hartwell was immobilized, the blood draining from his features, leaving his skin a pallid, waxy sheen. The initial drop of sweat on his temple was a clear signal of his panic. Rhee faced him, and he was met not by the waitress he dismissed as damaged goods, but by the auditor who had uncovered the entire deception. Moreover, restated, her voice lowering. When a banker discloses client finances absent a federal warrant, he violates the Bank Secrecy Act. The required penalty starts with a $500,000 fine and 10 years in federal prison. She allowed the statement to linger before revealing a folded document from her pocket. But the evidence is here. A confirmation of a wire transfer from Jerkov Holdings to a private account at Butterfield Bank in the Caymans. The account holder is Grant Arthur Hartwell, $250,000. This was sent 3 weeks prior to this gathering. Mr. Jerkov compensated Mr. Hartwell to falsify these documents and ruin the Valetti family. If the council still requires a confidence vote, I suggest we first vote on forwarding this proof to the FBI. The room's silence was now complete. A stillness fell over the 14 men, their bodies like granite sculptures. Jerkov placed his hands flat on the table, a calculated slow movement that belied the fury pulsing in his jaw. His perception of Rhee had fundamentally shifted. Contempt was replaced by a cold, analytical esteem. Grant Hartwell shot to his feet, his chair shrieking across the marble as a silent scream escaped his open mouth. The woman he'd dismissed over a $280,000 debt had just engineered his public execution before the Midwest's most formidable figures. He seized his briefcase without a sound and vanished, the door clicking shut with the finality of a prison bolt. From his seat, Felix Valetti, who had once branded Rhee a risk, leaned into the silence. His words cut through the room. For anyone still uncertain, allow me to clarify. This is my sister-in-law. To reach her, you must first come through me. Conrad then rose. A man whose power was in action, not words. He made his declaration physically. He placed a hand on Rhee's waist, drawing her to him to present a singular, unbreakable front. His gray-blue gaze met Jerkov's. Not with anger, but with something far deadlier, the absolute cold of possession. She is my wife, a Valetti. Are there any others who wish to dispute this? The council remained silent. The vote was a dead issue. Within 10 minutes, Jerkov was gone, having offered no further comment. And so, Rhee Calloway, once labeled damaged goods, departed the Palmer House Hotel into the March sunlight, flanked by Conrad, Felix, and Paige, her ascent already solidifying into a Chicago underworld legend. In the ensuing months, the Valetti family didn't just recover, it entered a period of expansion not seen in a decade. Rhee became part of Conrad's inner circle, not merely as his spouse, but as a strategic mind, rebuilding their finances with an accountant's precision and the heart of a survivor who had lost all fear. Her proposal gave even Conrad pause. A systemic purification of their monetary flow, transferring assets from legally gray ventures into legitimate holdings and buying properties via laundered shell companies. It was less a moral correction than a strategic pivot designed to bring the Valetti name out of the shadows. A lawful empire would offer no purchase for federal investigators or council meddling. Following a week of tense deliberation, Conrad gave his terse approval. Proceed! This was her mandate. By June, for the first time in their history, legitimate real estate revenue eclipsed their illicit income. That July, Conrad secured territory in southern Indiana without a single act of violence. Lawful capital had proven to be a more formidable tool than fear. The most profound transformation, though, was in Felix. Once the perpetual outsider, he was now an integral part, sharing morning coffee with Rhee at the kitchen island. Their exchanges were terse, the efficient dialect of two people who disdained superfluous words. He started consulting her, initially on matters of security, then personnel, and eventually on overarching strategy. When a subordinate questioned Rhee during a June meeting, Felix silenced the challenge in under 45 seconds with a chilling resolution that was never referenced again, but was seared into memory. He was no longer solely Conrad's enforcer. He had become the protector of the new Valetti dynasty, with Rhee as its undeniable center. Paige, in early June, submitted her application to the School of the Art Institute of Chicago for fashion design. This was a 3-year-old aspiration she had buried when her family's world, following her mother's death, became about survival rather than dreams. It was Rhee who discovered Paige's hidden sketchbook and validated her ambition with the statement, "You possess a remarkable talent." It was Rhee who funded the tuition from a fund Conrad had opened for her, capital she never accessed, as a life of deprivation had given her no framework for personal spending. Yet she knew how to nurture Paige's potential. Tommy's recovery was a subdued marvel. He remained a quiet presence, a phantom in the third-floor art studio. But his work began to evolve. In the time before Rye, his canvases were tempests of bleak colors and isolated, indistinct forms. His art transformed into the family's emotional chronicle. Somber canvases now burst with chromatic vibrancy. The inviting yellow of the kitchen fixtures, the gentle red hue of the hearth, the soft blue of a Chicago sky seen through his window. More importantly, he began rendering figures, leaving behind the abstract smears of his past. Paige smiling, Felix with his coffee, Nana and Noah bickering on the sofa. And at the nexus of almost every composition was Rhee, the stabilizing force. His isolation waned. He started joining them for meals, increasing from 3 times a week to 5, and then daily. Language returned, spare but emerging, each phrase a stone, resetting a foundation broken by trauma. The 16-year-old twins, Na and Noah, once antagonistic, now vied for the spot beside her on the couch. And Na, the girl who weaponized her words, shifted from addressing Rhee with silence to her name, and ultimately to the single term that redefined their reality. Sister. This subtle change in address held more gravity than any official agreement brokered downtown. A delicate harmony settled upon the house, an equilibrium that held until August. A scent was what shattered it. Rhee, who had operated on espresso since she was 18, the very fuel of her resilience, developed an abrupt, intense aversion to it. The smell of coffee, once a symbol of routine, became an offense. One morning, as Margaret Byrne prepared a fresh pot, the aroma triggered a wave of sickness, so potent Rhee had to bolt for the bathroom to heave. Initially, she attributed it to the fatigue of 14-hour days spent cleansing financial records. She sought relief, hydrating, altering her diet, but the illness persisted. The nausea struck again on the 3rd day. By the 5th, the room would tilt whenever she stood. On the 7th, the simple smell of roasting meat sent her to the balcony for 10 minutes, desperate for fresh air. A latent terror began to surface, a cold, specific dread known only to a child who has witnessed a parent succumb to a slow-moving sickness. Her thoughts turned to dark possibilities about the assault, the glass in her foot, the infection she concealed for 3 weeks. She wondered about a delayed action poison. She concealed it, a defense mechanism sharpened over 27 years of fending for herself. Her default reaction to any weakness was to hide the evidence. But Conrad Valetti was an observer of nuance. He registered the absence of her morning coffee. He noted her new avoidance of the grill. He perceived the slight narrowing of her eyes when she rose, a micro-expression of a body resisting vertigo. He saw these details because for 5 months he had made her his study, committing to memory every contour and shadow of her face until he could differentiate a genuine smile from a facade. And on that day, she was wearing a facade. One August evening, Conrad appeared in the kitchen doorway, observing Rhea at the sink. He was never one for indirectness. "What are you concealing from me?" Rhea went rigid, her hands still in the stream of water. "Nothing. The last nothing was sepsis that nearly killed you. I will not repeat the question, Rhea." A beat of silence. She shut off the faucet, placed a dish down, and turned to him. In her eyes, Conrad saw something he had scarcely ever witnessed there. Absolute terror. "I'm ill every morning. Coffee's smell makes me sick. I get dizzy. I have no idea what it is, but this is how it began with my mother." Conrad crossed the space between them, his hands closing on her shoulders. His gaze was cold, hard steel, a look she now understood, not as rage, but as fear, the kind a sovereign only reveals to his consort. "Tomorrow, 7 o'clock, Northwestern Memorial. We're seeing Dr. Helen Ross in obstetrics and endocrinology, the city's finest. Not Stanton, not the family physician, the best." Rhea started to wonder about the relevance of obstetrics, but was too drained to argue. When Conrad Valetti adopted that tone, even she understood compliance was the only option. At 7:12 in the morning, from the 4th floor of Northwestern Memorial, Dr. Helen Ross's office provided a view of Lake Michigan. Rhea sat on the exam table, her fingers knotted together, her gaze locked on the gray-blue horizon as she fought to steady the wild rhythm of her heart. Beside her, Conrad was a statue of stillness, his posture perfectly erect. His knuckles showed white where he gripped the chair's arms. Rhea understood that beneath the iron facade he was terrified. She knew this because in 8 months she had learned to interpret the subtle signals of this deeply complex man. And she knew Conrad Valetti only clenched his fists that way when preparing for a mortal blow. Dr. Helen Ross entered, holding the test results. At 52, with short, salt and pepper hair and discerning eyes, she projected the aura of a professional with 30 years of experience who was impressed by nothing, not even a crime lord. She took a seat, looked at the chart, and then met their eyes with an unreadable expression. It was not pity, nor was it clinical distance. It was the look of someone about to alter a universe. "Mrs. Valetti, Dr. Yu," Ross started, her voice businesslike. "Before we review these findings, I need to ask your husband a question." She directed her attention to Conrad. "Mr. Valetti, who informed you that you were permanently sterile?" The scar on Conrad's jaw grew taut. "Dr. Philip Stanton, our family doctor. 3 years ago, following a poisoning, the analysis confirmed irreversible damage." Dr. Ross gave a slow nod, setting her pen aside. When she spoke next, her voice was gentler, each word chosen with care. "Mr. Valetti, I've examined your complete medical history from that event 3 years ago. Modeled the toxin, likely an industrial agent, inflicted devastating trauma upon your reproductive anatomy." At that juncture, Dr. Stanton's assessment was, clinically speaking, correct. The final word was left suspended, and the air fled Rhea's lungs. However, the human body has a profound capacity for regeneration when its circumstances change. Improved nourishment, diminished anxiety, security. Such elements can mend what was deemed permanently broken. The prognosis from 3 years prior was a snapshot, not a prophecy. Conrad betrayed no reaction. He remained utterly motionless, his focus fixed upon the physician. Ree noticed his knuckles whitening as they bit into the armchair's leather. He was bracing for the blow, conditioned by 3 years in which the word "but" had become a harbinger of disaster. Dr. Ross then shifted her attention to Ree, her lips hinting at a smile. "Mrs. Valady, your health is excellent. Your condition stems from neither a toxin nor a malady. You are expecting. About 11 weeks along." The world seemed to liquefy. The panorama of Lake Michigan blurred into indistinctness. The clinical glare, the antiseptic aroma, the drone of machinery, all receded. Her consciousness narrowed to the singular phrase reverberating in the quiet: pregnant 11 weeks. For a span of 5 heartbeats, Ree was frozen. Then her palms flattened against her abdomen, feeling a solidity she now understood as burgeoning life, not ailment. "But," Ree whispered, her voice trembling as her sight swam, "they insisted it was impossible for 3 years. The specialist declared it permanent." "How?" A knowing smile graced Dr. Ross's features. "I have been a physician for 30 years, Mrs. Valiti. If I have learned anything, it is to never declare something about the human body to be irreversible, particularly when a person has a formidable drive to recover." Her eyes moved to Conrad, still rigid in his seat, before returning to Ree. "I will allow you both some privacy." She stood, gathered the chart, and exited the room, the door shutting with a soft click. A dense, sterile silence settled. Only the faint, metronomic hiss of the blood pressure cuff and 2 sets of breaths were audible. Ree observed Conrad. He stayed seated, his gaze lost on some distant, invisible point. She took in the face of the man that Chicago called a beast, the man who governed a billion-dollar empire through sheer will. She had watched him endure every imaginable worldly attack with stoic indifference. Now she beheld a phenomenon entirely new. He was fracturing, not from any physical agony, but from a truth his psyche could not process. Conrad did not stand. He descended from his chair in a fluid collapse, as though his skeleton had disintegrated. His knees met the cold linoleum. He inclined forward, his forehead coming to rest against Ree's midsection. His large, scarred hands enveloped her waist, his face buried in her clothing, and then a tremor racked his shoulders. No sound escaped him. Conrad Valetti's capacity for audible weeping had been extinguished the night his mother perished on their parlor floor 4 years prior. His body now mourned in his stead. His frame was seized by great, violent shudders, reminiscent of a levee failing against a torrent. Through these fissures, 3 years of deep-seated psychic shame burst forth. 3 years of being labeled the termination of his lineage. 3 years of rivals murmuring that his authority had a finite term. 3 years of vacant nights spent gazing at the ceiling, pondering the void that would consume his legacy. This torrent of despair was unleashed on the floor of a 4th-story clinic at Northwestern Memorial. His brow pressed against his wife's abdomen where a minuscule new heart beat 160 times per minute, a heart that medical certainty had deemed impossible. Ree tangled her hands in his hair, her grip firm as her own tears carved trails on her face. Yet she smiled through her tears, a tremulous, luminous expression of emergence from prolonged darkness into an abrupt, dazzling radiance. "Do you sense it, Conrad?" Ree murmured, her voice fractured but lucid. "Can you sense it? We are having a child." On the cold linoleum of that clinical space, Chicago's most formidable man held fast to his wife's waist, his weeping like that of one rediscovering a core component of his own soul. and the woman society had dismissed as irreparably flawed, simply embraced him, caressing his hair, certain she had never been defective, never spoiled, never in fertile land, for the impossible was gestating within her. Day by day, quiet, enduring, and formidable, a reflection of its mother. In the subsequent spring, 1 year on, as cherry blossoms clouded Lake Michigan's shore in white, and a warm breeze first displaced Chicago's 6-month chill, Ree delivered a healthy son at Northwestern Memorial Hospital. This was the very institution where, 6 months prior, she had occupied an exam table and received the 3 words that altered her existence. The newborn weighed 3.4 kilograms, wailed robustly, and was in flawless health. As the physician placed him on Ree's chest for the first time, she gazed at the small, crimson, defiant face, and she cried. Her tears were not of pain or fatigue, but of vindication. She was holding living evidence that repudiated every cruel verdict society had rendered upon her. They named him James. James Calloway Valetti. The middle name was a legacy from Ree's own lineage, from her father, a Rockford steel worker lost in a workplace tragedy when she was 11. He left no insurance, no compensation, and no trace of his life, but his daughter's recollection. That name now adorned the birth certificate of the Valetti dynasty's successor. Ree pictured her father, somewhere approving. Conrad remained at her bedside through the entire 6-hour ordeal, his hand gripping hers. And as their son voiced his initial cry, Chicago's most ruthless syndicate leader lowered his head to kiss his wife's brow, rendered speechless as emotion constricted his throat. This marked the second instance in Ree's experience of him weeping. She resolved in that moment that no external power would ever again wring tears of anguish from this man. Henceforth, his weeping would be born only of happiness. 2 weeks on, the Lincoln Park residence was altered. Any of the organization's ranking captains would have found the scene surreal. Felix Valetti, at 28, the family's lieutenant whose subordinates quaked before him, was seated on the sofa. He held the infant with a hilarious and overwrought exactitude, elbows fixed at a precise 90-degree angle and his back rigid, as if diffusing an explosive. His features were more taut with focus than they ever were confronting a foe. Each minute movement from James elicited a look of sheer terror from Felix toward Ree, as though the 3.4-kilogram baby represented the most dire menace of his career. In a corner, Tommy stood at his easel. The canvas depicted a sleeping James, a work of supreme technical mastery and profound emotional depth. Its power lay not in its perfect execution, but in the fact that for the first time in 4 years, Tommy's work contained no gloom, no chiaroscuro, no solitary forms. There was only luminescence. A warm, gilded radiance from the kitchen lights bathed the infant's sleeping face. Upon completion, he brought the portrait to Ree and presented it, stating in a calm, firm tone, "This is yours. It is the first piece I have ever created that I truly cherish." Meanwhile, Noah vied so persistently for his turn with James that Margaret Byrne instituted a rotation resembling a hospital shift roster. Noah was allotted 30 minutes, followed by the next in line. The 16-year-old twins, who had once concealed Ree's footwear and labeled her bargain bin refuse, now addressed her as Sister Ree. They referred to James as our baby, with the absolute, guileless possessiveness of youth. Paige gifted James his first attire, personally stitched from soft white cotton with pale blue accents. It was the inaugural creation of a first-year design student at the School of the Art Institute of Chicago. When Ree clothed James in it, Paige cried, not from sorrow, but because the last infant she saw in a handmade garment in this home was when her mother was living, and at last that aching recollection found its closure. Later that evening, once a hush had fallen over the house, Ree was seated in the cognac leather chair Conrad had commissioned for her near the hearth. James slept on her chest, his small, steady breaths a warm presence. The fire murmured quietly. Conrad was by the window, his form resting against the oak casing, his attention directed inward. His focus was not on the external world, but the domestic one. He observed Ree and James. He saw Tommy's artwork mounted on the wall. He noted Paige's handcrafted garment on a chair. He saw Felix's abandoned cold coffee beside the firearm he had left behind, a sidearm he had, for the first time ever, failed to remember he was armed with. His gaze fell upon the sneakers Nana and Noah had abandoned in a heap, their scramble to welcome the baby leaving a jumble of shoes by the door. He absorbed the entire scene, each minor, chaotic, flawed detail that vibrated with life. In that moment, he understood that this specific condition of being was what he had, only 3 years ago, resigned himself to never having. What he had found was not an empire, nor dominion, nor affluence, but a home characterized by cast-off shoes and a strange alchemy of infant formula, oil paint, and cold coffee. A family. The narrative that she was broken was false. She had always been complete. She was Ree Valetti, mother of James, the gravitational force for the 6 Valades, the understated sovereign of their empire, the woman who had come into this house in worn-out footwear with a hollowed-out soul and fashioned it into a sanctuary. This was achieved not with money, nor with power, but with the one element no one could ever procure or subdue, a spirit that would not yield. Deep within the shadowed study on the estate's ground floor, secured inside a 300-kilogram steel vault known only to Conrad, lay a delicate piece of evidence. It was nestled beside 3 handguns, 2 counterfeit passports, and $750,000 in emergency funds. It was a small, folded piece of aged yellow paper, the receipt from Serafina, from an October evening 1 year past. The first instance Conrad Valetti entered that establishment and observed a waitress who stood her ground in a den of predators. On its back, written in Conrad's stark, right-leaning handwriting, was a solitary, potent declaration. She did not yield. I have located her. The saga of Ree and Conrad was never a storybook romance. The case file on the subject offered no fables, no foretold messiahs, no fairy tale endings. It was a chronicle shaped by the stark mechanics of survival, by financial ruin, by physical threat, by bodily trauma, and by the failure of institutions. But it possessed something legends do not: empirical, unassailable data. And this data pointed to a profound reevaluation of worth, that a person's value is not a function of their assets, their lineage, or the second-hand opinions of society. Instead, value was located in the resolve to rebuild from total devastation, in the empathy extended to the disenfranchised, and in the ability to love despite being conditioned for a lifetime to feel undeserving. The individual, Reese, began this chapter wearing $12 shoes and concluded it as the head of an enterprise. But the final prize was neither control nor currency. It was the confirmation of a severe proposition, that unyielding resistance against crushing force will, over time, compel fate to submit. If this analysis has resonated with you on a significant level, document your reaction, disseminate this file throughout your network, and subscribe to receive ongoing examination. We are compiling a repository of evidence mapping how this subject's journey mirrors your own patterns of ruin and renewal. Contribute your own narrative below. Each submission is archived and studied for its recurring themes. We operate from the understanding that the pinnacle of human existence is discovered in wellness, in psychological equilibrium, and in tranquility. We appreciate your attention. This transmission is concluded. Await the following broadcast.
The house receives Reese like a mausoleum with chandeliers, marble floors, cathedral ceilings, rooms so polished they feel untouched by warmth. Conrad moves through it like a man carved from old winter carrying silence the way soldiers carry scars. Reese arrives in cheap shoes and with no illusions. She knows this is not a wedding. It is an arrangement with Danger dressed in black. But danger does not frighten her half as much as emptiness does. So she begins with small rebellions, a warm meal, a set table, the smell of garlic and butter cutting through a mansion that had forgotten the language of home. Paige appears first, then the twins, then pieces of a family begin drifting back toward the light. Even Tommy, hidden upstairs in his art room, starts responding in sketches left like secret prayers. Then the night explodes. The power dies. The glass breaks. The hallways turn blue with moonlight and fear. Somewhere on the third floor, Tommy is frozen inside an old trauma. Trapped again in the night his mother died. Reese hears it before anyone says it. If no one goes for him, the darkness will. So she runs. Bare feet on cold wood, fever in her blood. A paper knife in her hand so small it would be laughable in any other scene. But the moment the killer steps through that doorway, the room changes. Reese stands between death and a trembling boy, and suddenly the paper knife no longer matters. Her choice does. That is why the scene works so powerfully. Not because she is stronger, not because she is armed, but because courage in its purest form is not the absence of fear, it is movement despite fear. In that room, Reese becomes unforgettable because she chooses to stand where most people would flee.